This is Best of the West number 3, The Continuing Adventures of Odysseus. Last time we talked about the Lotus Eaters and the Cyclops. This time we're going to talk about the rest of the major episodes in the Odyssey. Circe, the Land of the Dead, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, Calypso, and return to Ithaca. After escaping the Cyclops, Odysseus and his men come to the island of Circe, and she's a witch. This episode again shows the importance of living by reason and forethought instead of by impulse, passion, or emotion. The image which sticks with most people from this episode is Circe changing Odysseus' men into pigs. This, of course, symbolizes how the men have degraded themselves into an animal state because they are ruled by sensual desires. Because it's their eating and drinking and their admiration for Circe's lovely braids that puts them in her pig pen, rooting for acorns as they roll in the mud. We also get in here what's called a set piece, where Circe's nymphs serve Odysseus and wait on him. This becomes a widely copied motif in Western adventure stories. Homer anticipates many James Bond Happy Meals when he tells us, beat by beat, how one nymph draped the chairs with crimson covers, a second drew up silver tables and laid out golden trays, a third mulled wine in a silver bowl and set out golden cups, a fourth brought water and lit a blazing fire beneath a massive cauldron. Once the water boiled, the maidens eased him into a tub and bathed him from the cauldron, mixing the hot and cold to suit his taste, showering head and shoulders. All of this is supposed to soften up Odysseus for the kill, just like a prize ox is fattened before it's slaughtered. But he's a harder target than his men. Circe's magic doesn't work on him, because he keeps his reason. She says, with grudging respect, "You have a mind no magic can enchant." So finally he makes her change his men back into human form. Their bristles slipped away from their limbs, and they turned back into men. The description of this shape-shifting of humans into animals or back again will become riffing material for a whole book by the Roman poet Ovid. And the next episode we're going to discuss, The Visit to the Underworld, has even longer legs in Western literature. So let's go on to the Land of the Dead. Odysseus goes down into the underworld, and as far as we can tell, this is the first time in the Western tradition that a hero or character goes into the underworld or the afterlife or hell or Hades. But this becomes an important device or element in a number of other stories afterward. One of them is Virgil's Aeneid, which we will read in a couple weeks. When we read Dante's Inferno toward the end of the semester, we'll see Dante going down into the underworld, led by Virgil. And then in the second semester, we'll return to the underworld in Goethe, Nietzsche, James Joyce, and T.S. Eliot. If anyone has seen The Godfather, in that movie there's a portion where Michael goes to Sicily, and that serves the function of Odysseus going to the land of the dead, in the sense that Michael asks where all the men are, and he learns that they've all been killed, and he sees there the consequences of this kind of life. So, long story short, a visit to the land of the dead is an important motif in Western literature. From Homer's description, it's unclear if Odysseus actually goes down into the underworld or if the underworld comes up to him as a kind of vision. After invoking the nations of the dead, I took the sacrificial sheep, and with my silver-studded sword I cut their throats. The dark blood flowed in, and up the ghosts came, flocking toward me now, the ghosts of the dead and gone. Now, Odysseus comes across the ghost of the prophet Tiresias. This Tiresias is the wise old man of Greek literature. He's an oracle and a mentor character, like Obi-Wan Kenobi or Dumbledore. He dispenses wisdom, and the advice he gives Odysseus underscores this theme of not letting your emotions get the better of you, which we saw when Odysseus named himself to the Cyclops. Tiresias tells Odysseus, "You and your crew may still reach home, if only you have the power to curb their wild desire and curb your own." And that's a sentence I think worth underlining. The idea of curbing your desires becomes a very important idea in Western moral philosophy. We'll come across it in Socrates, in Plato, in Aristotle, and in all the Roman philosophers. The idea is that you should rule your emotions and not let your emotions rule you. Also down in Hades, Odysseus meets the ghost of his mother, and there's this touching scene where he says, "3 times I rushed toward her, desperate to hold her. 3 times she flooded through my fingers. sifting away like a shadow, dissolving in a dream. I find that a very sad passage. He's trying to reunite with his mother, but it's her ghost, and they're from different worlds, so it doesn't work. This idea of hugging someone 3 times and having it not work is copied by Virgil, and it's copied by Dante, and you will even see it in Stranger Things, when Eleven's in the Upside Down, another way of saying underworld, and she tries to hug her mother, but her mother disappears into black smoke. Same idea, same thing. Then Odysseus meets the ghost of the Greek general Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek forces in the Trojan War. His homecoming has been marred by the fact that his wife murdered him, and his ghost shows an attitude toward women which we call misogyny. We see this attitude too in the Hebrew myth of Eve eating the apple, in the Greek myth of Pandora and her box, and certainly in the story of Helen of Troy, who supposedly caused the Trojan War with her beauty. Agamemnon's complaint leads Odysseus to reflect that women are the source of problems for humanity. Zeus, the Thunder King, has made women's twisted wiles his trustiest weapon. What armies of us died for the sake of Helen? Your wife schemed your death. Now, this is what we might call a limited sample. Odysseus cites only 2 cases, and we'll see that his own wife, Penelope, is an important exception to the rule. But it is a rule, and it's an important prejudice in the Western tradition that women cause trouble. And unfortunately for women, this prejudice lasted a long time, up until just about 100 years ago, when women finally obtained political equality. Finally, Odysseus comes across the ghost of Achilles. Achilles is in the good part of the underworld, the Elysian Fields, which corresponds to heaven. And Odysseus says to him, you've got it pretty good here, and you're king of all these heroes in the afterlife. But Achilles doesn't see it that way. And I want to make sure that you underline the following sentence, which Achilles' ghost says to Odysseus. He says, "I'd rather slave on earth for another man, some dirt-poor farmer who scrapes to keep alive, than rule down here over all the breathless dead." So Achilles is not into heaven at all. He'd rather have the worst position on earth than the best position in heaven. And this is a contrast, I would note, to Christianity. When we come across Christianity in maybe 3 weeks, it's never depicted that people in heaven are anything short of perfect. They're with God, they're with their dead relatives, everything is perfect, happiness and light, no one ever wants to go back to life on this earth. So that's a huge difference between the Greeks and the Romans, what we call classical antiquity, and the Christians. These classical people placed a high value on life on this earth. After Christianity comes, the value of life on earth doesn't return until the Renaissance. But once it returns, it stays. And I think today we are far closer to the Greeks and the Romans in our emphasis on being happy in this world, in this life, than we are to where the Christians were for a long time. From the land of the dead, Odysseus has this adventure with the sirens. He lashes himself to the mast to hear their song. He does this, he says, wanting to do what no man had ever done, to hear the sirens and live to tell of it. And of course this echoes Priam in the Iliad, going to do what no man had ever done before, kissing the hand of the man who killed his son. So here again we get this kind of Star Trek heroism. Pathfinding, exploration, innovation. Being first. Doing what no one has ever done. After the sirens, Odysseus has to deal with these twin dangers of the Scylla and Charybdis. We see here the idea that you have to choose the middle path between extremes. This will recur in the Ethics of Aristotle and in lots of other places too. In a lot of stories, heroes will have to thread a needle or pass through clashing rocks, squeeze through closing doors. Lancelot has to cross a narrow sword bridge, or Luke Skywalker has to make the perfect shot into the Death Star. As Aristotle says, there are many ways you can fail, but only one way to hit the target perfectly. These twin dangers also symbolize the idea that sometimes in life you're caught between 2 alternatives, and they both seem bad. So you're trying to figure out what's called the lesser of 2 evils. Damned if I do, damned if I don't. Often that feels like an aspect of the human condition, and there's a lot of dark proverbs expressing that feeling. The cure might be worse than the disease, or you have to destroy the village in order to save it. So when people were more literate back in the 1980s, you would hear a senator referring to Scylla and Charybdis as a metaphor for difficult choices. After Odysseus clears the Scylla and Charybdis, he comes to the island of this goddess Calypso. And let's talk first about the description of Calypso's cave. Thick woods edged the cave. There birds nested, owls and hawks, and wave-skimming ravens folding their wings. Round the cave's mouth trailed a clustered vine bursting with ripe grapes. 4 springs bubbled clear and cold, running channels left and right. Soft meadows spread with violets. Even Hermes the god gazed in wonder. Finally he entered the vaulted cave. A fire blazed on the hearth, and he could smell cedar and sweetwood. This is a famous passage because if you add in the meal that Calypso serves Hermes when he enters the cave, we've got all 5 senses operating here. That fits with what's going on in this scene and what's going on the whole time that Odysseus is staying with Calypso. He's sucked in by her sensuality, and his life with her is based on sensory gratification. They're eating and drinking and making love. She's a beautiful, immortal goddess, and she's basically keeping him for her own pleasure. So the style is integrated with what's going on in terms of the plot. The sensuous language sets the scene for this sensuous episode. There's this saying in literary criticism that setting establishes values, and Calypso's cave is a case of that. The setting establishes exotic physical values in contrast to the values which actually Odysseus is trying to get home to, like his wife and his kid and his dog. So these are not those domestic values, and they aren't ultimately the deepest values that you could have as a husband and a father and a man. These exotic values are keeping him from his domestic values, and that's a philosophical point. So I just thought that was good on Homer's part, considering it's almost 3,000 years ago, and this was oral poetry, a kind of rap song that took like 3 days to perform. It's remarkable that this kind of attention was paid to the writing, and that's why people study this work, because it rewards that kind of analysis. Finally, there's a note in this scene that counterpoints what Achilles says in the underworld. It's a poignant note of love for life on this earth. Just as Achilles would rather be the poorest man alive than king of the dead, so Odysseus would rather live a short time as a man with his own wife than live forever as a god with a beautiful goddess. Calypso offers him that choice, but he turns her down. This is a pure expression of humanism. So Odysseus leaves Calypso because he loves his mortal wife. But since his ships have all wrecked and his crew have all died, he has to go it alone. He sets to work building a raft, and here again Homer describes the process beat by beat. He set to cutting trunks. He had the work done in no time. 20 in all he felled. He trimmed them clean with his axe and split them deftly, trued them straight. This detail goes on for dozens of lines depicting Odysseus as the consummate man of craft and skill. He made the craft broad in the beam and bottom, flat as a merchantman when a master shipwright turns out her hull. He rigged it, then eased the raft with levers into the sunlit sea. Odysseus grasped the tiller and steered his craft like a master mariner, scanning the stars. The whole passage celebrates the ideal of what Jacques Barzun called the competent man. Barzun had in mind James Bond, but the parallels to Odysseus are obvious. There is always a Greek prototype. One final point. Odysseus' industry and forethought is in the service of his family. In that sense, not just this passage, but the whole poem is an ode to what we might call bourgeois consciousness. Progressive critics might call it the myth of white male competence. By whatever name, it's the opposite of what the barbarian Cyclops have going on. It's a sensibility that will stamp the Western male mind in literature and in life. It's an outlook that will eventually flourish in Daniel Defoe's 1727 novel, Robinson Crusoe, and in the ethos of the British Empire, before decomposing in great novels like Moby Dick and Joseph Conrad's Lord Jim. All alone on his raft fighting the elements, Odysseus has what's known in literary terms as the night sea journey. It's equivalent to Jonah being in the belly of the whale, if anyone remembers that from the Jewish Bible. A lot of times there's a journey over water at night when we're crossing a threshold between worlds. Even in the first Harry Potter book, where they take the boats to the castle when they first get to Hogwarts, that's a kind of night sea journey between worlds. And for Odysseus, it actually is a transition between worlds, and he's going to prove that he's the master of both of these worlds. And there's a very curious symbolic passage in Homer that tells us so. Because he's finally tossed ashore on this island, which is very close to home, and not far from the water he found a grove and crawled between 2 bushy olive trees. Each sprang from the same root, one wild and the other well-bred. Now when I first read that, I wondered why the heck Homer would go to all the trouble of saying that there's these 2 olive trees and they come from the same root, but one is wild and the other is well-bred. When an author goes out of his lane to tell you something like that, a critical reader thinks, this must be some kind of symbol. So let's think of parts of the text where Odysseus shows that he's well-bred and also that he's wild. He starts out in the ordinary world of Ithaca, a well-bred king plowing his fields when he's called away to the special world of the adventure in the Trojan War. There, and on the way back, he masters wild warriors and witches and monsters and goddesses and the wild elemental sea. But finally he makes it home, so he's back in the ordinary world of Ithaca again. So now he's master of both worlds. When he finally passes out beneath these two trees, one wild and the other well-bred, Homer's saying he's completed his identity. He's both a wild man and a well-bred man, and he's united the two. As Odysseus approaches his palace in disguise, only his old dog recognizes him. The dog is mangy, infested with fleas and ticks, half dead from neglect. But he's loyal. Odysseus, for his part, is dressed like a homeless person, dirty, smelly, but he's also loyal. In fact, he kind of makes himself like his dog to return home. People kick him and make fun of him, and he returns as the lowest person to his own kingdom, to his own throne, to his own household. He comes as the very lowest person, and he rises from that lowest point to triumph because he strings the bow. Again, Odysseus stringing the bow shows that he's a man of skill. He's good with his hands. He's shown this in building his raft and in sharpening the stake to stab the Cyclops' eye. But Homer gives us another key data point here at the end of the story in the bit about the tree bed. At this point, he's come face to face with his loyal wife Penelope. She's waited for him for 20 years, but she's as tricky as he is, which is one of the reasons they belong together. To trick the suitors that are trying to get her to marry them, she's been working for 20 years, knitting something, and when it's done, she'll choose one of these suitors to marry, she says. But every night she unwinds what she did that day, and so she never gets it done. So she's very crafty, just like Odysseus, and she lays this little trap for him, a test, because it's 20 years later, and she thinks, well, this guy might be Odysseus, but he might not be. It's been a long time, so she says something that only Odysseus will know is a trick. She tells her maids to move her bed and make it ready for Odysseus, but of course the bed can't be moved because Odysseus carved it out of a tree, so it's rooted in the earth. And only Odysseus would know that. And of course he objects and says the bed can't be moved, and so she realizes it's really him. He has validated his identity. But what do you think the tree bed symbolizes? It's rooted in the earth, indicating that their marriage is natural. From this natural thing, this tree, they build a bed where they sleep together and make a family. That symbolizes the natural home, a good solid marriage. If you build your marriage bed out of a tree, that implies something super solid, a very strong marriage. Even though Odysseus on his way home got seduced by a goddess, he's crying when he's with this goddess because he wants to go home to his wife. So Odysseus finds his way home, and so the Odyssey ends. It's been a very popular story for 3 millennia because it's about the reunification of a divided family. In that sense, it's much like a comedy. In a comic movie, typically in the end, everyone who's separated comes together, and often it ends with a big full-dress marriage scene. In tragedy, it's the opposite. Tragedy is about the destruction of a family unit. So whether it's in Shakespeare's Hamlet or in the Greek tragedies or even in the Iliad, we see a family dissolve. For that reason, Aristotle thought that the Iliad was the first tragedy and the Odyssey was the first comedy. In the Iliad, there's a family destroyed. Priam and his wife lose their son Hector, and we see them grieving over this and even going to kiss the hands of the man who killed their son. So that's really a tragic sensibility. There's no comedy in the Iliad, even though on a few occasions gods or men are portrayed as cruelly laughing at others' misfortunes. But in the Odyssey, we do see a comic sensibility. When Odysseus initially says his name is Nobody, and then Polyphemus tells the other Cyclops that nobody is bothering him, so they don't come to his aid, people have been laughing about that for 3,000 years.